All right, everybody. I thought we'd take a look at the internet weather for this week. And first up is the most probe ports report. So this is kind of looking at the top 10 ports that we see most probed by volume, not necessarily by how many people are probing on it or how many individual source IPs, but just sheer volume of scanning activity. So we see a lot of things that we see here typically. 445 TCP, which is the Microsoft. I'm sorry, I thought I heard something.
It sounded like a truck or something.
I thought I heard something too. Okay. If you could just back up and.
Yep. Okay. So right, on the top 10 for this week, we kick it off with 445 TCP, which is the Microsoft file sharing SMB protocol. We see that a lot because there's been various vulnerabilities over the years, notably Eternal Blue and some of these other ones that were leveraged in some pretty high-profile ransomware activity like WannaCry, et cetera, as well as other things historically like Conficker and things like that. So this is always a port of interest by attackers. 23 TCP is Telnet. Again, another one heavily used by a lot of the embedded IoT devices. So allows someone to log in remotely, as well as 22 TCP, which is SSH. I skipped over the ICMP because that's just kind of a scanning ping protocol that allows you to figure out if a device is alive or not. But that is in the number 3 spot, but it really probably doesn't present an actual exploit vulnerability as so much as it is reconnaissance. Then we have 443 TCP, which is HTTPS, people scanning for that. We really haven't, also the other thing to know about this week versus last week is not much of a change. The top 10 ports are still the same top 10 ports that they were last week. It's just that positions 5 and 6 changed position. So 443 and 1433 were in 5 and 6 respectively last week. So 1433 TCP is Microsoft SQL Server. We've seen that a lot because there's been historically lots of vulnerabilities and even just brute force password guessing that might go on against Microsoft SQL servers trying to get in port 1433. So that could be what's going on there. Port 80 and 81 are your HTTP ports. So you've got your web port, and 81 is typically an alternate HTTP port. But we're going to take a closer look at that one because there's some specific web server software that's being targeted there. 3389 is your remote desktop protocol, which again, a lot like SSH and Telnet, allows remote access to an endpoint device. And then 3306 TCP is MySQL Server, which is by Oracle. It's another very popular SQL Server engine. Probably similar types of activity, trying to see if there's open, exposed MySQL servers with weak passwords, things of that nature. So first off, we'll take a look at port 81 TCP. And you'll notice that there's some very persistent spikes that show up here. This is a 30-day chart. And I took a look at this. So we have kind of a noise floor that always occurs of maybe 100 to 150,000 scan flows per hour. But then there are these peaks, I want to say maybe 1, 2, 3, 4, every 4 days or so, roughly. When I looked at those to see what's going on there, that's actually census, census with a Y. And if you're not familiar with census.io, I recommend you check them out. They're kind of like Shodan, very similar. They scan the internet, kind of doing a inventory of what ports and services are open on the internet and what different devices might be exposed. And you can use that yourself, get an account on there, and find out what your home router might be exposing, assuming your IP doesn't change very often. Or your corporate enterprise, you can take a look there to see what's exposed. When we go to the honeypot for port 81 TCP, we can actually see what's going on here a little more closely. So I did a look at our honeypot to see, and this is kind of a passive honeypot that just collects Anybody who connects to port 81, tell me what you're trying to do. So we can see that by a large margin, 100 of the probably 200 or so, eyeballing 160 or so requests that we saw on port 81, we're all trying to get the page login.cgi. This is a well-known port associated with the go-ahead web server, so which is by a company called Embed This. And Embed This go-ahead web server is a really tiny, light web server that a lot of software people will use inside small embedded IoT type devices, you know, for various things to serve up an administrative panel or a configuration panel for, you know, some sort of maybe like a router, like a home router, or a DVR system, things of that nature. And there's been a lot of vulnerabilities over the years on the go-ahead web server. Different versions of it had different vulnerabilities. So I believe that's what they're looking for here, is they're trying to find if somebody is running go-ahead, and if they are, then they might come back and try to do some more further exploitation of it. So that's what's being scanned for here. The thing I thought was interesting, there's some lower counts of things here. So like /manager/HTML and /manager/text.list. This is scanning for Tomcat. So Tomcat's another kind of web container software package that's out there. And this manager HTML notably will give you the admin page for the Tomcat configuration if it's exposed. And so that's probably what they're looking for here, because port 81, a lot of people use that port for that. And then there are a couple of other interesting ones I saw here with like /language/Swedish. And then you can see that like they're embedding some commands in here to go remove a file, wget some other file. This one, actually, there's a lot of errors in these, which is probably why these people aren't very successful, because they forgot to close a curly brace here. But you can see there's a couple of URLs they're trying to fetch, and it looks like they're trying to get something called Mosey.a. Mosey is a pretty well-known botnet. So somebody's trying to spread Mosey through this method, and this is kind of a remote code execution vulnerability that they're trying to leverage here. And this remote code execution vulnerability actually ties back to this CCTV DVR remote code execution vulnerability. I linked the Palo Alto Networks report on this. This is an older report, but it gives you an example of some other people who have done this in the past, and they're still doing it. So something to keep an eye on, especially if you have any of these types of devices.
Yeah, this reminds me of whether, you know, I've seen talks about it in some discuss groups and things where, like, should pen testers have a specific user agent that we can, like, all agree upon? Obviously, the bad guys could fake it as well, but, you know, it's, to me, it's interesting that a more put together malicious group would not just give away what they're trying to attack. Like, they would test it, see if they have some fingerprinting of the thing they're trying to, you know, get to, and then they would send these custom scripts, right? Because otherwise they just give away what they're doing and they have peek and we block, right? Like that's silly. So it's just interesting that maybe it's just like amateur versus non-amateur. I don't know. Just to see that some people are just trying to log into CGI and you're moving along versus like somebody just trying to throw a whole script in there and hoping that it works.
Right. Yeah, I mean, you see a mixture of things depending on the vulnerability on occasion.
But you don't, but you don't see your honeypot doesn't. It's just a port open, right? Like it doesn't fake to be anything, right? Like it doesn't pretend to be a thing.
No, right. It doesn't go and try to. It's not interactive and try to pretend and play along, so to speak, with whatever their vulnerability is. We have a couple of other ones that do that in some of our spaces, but this one is more of just a passive listening on every single port to see, you know, just in case some new port comes up that we're not, you know, we're not expecting activity on. This one listens on every single port. So
right. Okay, cool.
So then next up on the list is the most sources probing report. And this one, I prefer it because usually what this one's looking for is where you have a whole bunch of source IPs in unison scanning on a specific port, which usually is more indicative of some sort of botnet-related activity. Even though we saw clearly that stuff before was botnet-related activity over on the other chart, this one is definitely much more focused in that it's going to be related to botnet-related activity. Not much change. You know, we mentioned a lot of these other ports before. Port 8080 we did not mention, but that is another alternate HTTP port that's also scanned, also used frequently by lots of other things like Tomcat and all kinds of web panels for different software products. The two that kind of stand out here that I've highlighted, 8728 and 8291 TCP, these are related to MikroTik. We'll take a closer look at that. And then again, we have Microsoft SQL Server on 1433 TCP, and then 5555 TCP. This has been going on quite a while. This is the Android debug bridge, so we'll take a closer look at that as well. Let's jump into the MikroTik one. And when we look at the MikroTik activity, this is a 60-day view, and you could see like somewhere around the 22nd, or I guess yeah, it's the 22nd of December of last year. Activity kicked up again, and we've got this real regular pattern. These two ports, we'll look at them in a little more detail on the next slide, but they're both related to MikroTik, and they do different service functions for MikroTik routers. MikroTik is a very popular home router, especially it's popular in the United States, but more so in other countries as well. I think in Asia Pac and those kinds of countries, MikroTik is very popular there. There was also another, surge back here, probably around the 7th or 8th, I'm going to guess, of December of 2020, where this was happening. The other thing to take note of this activity is that I'm showing you both ports in kind of a river chart stacked here, and you can see that they both kind of occur at the exact same time. So the sources that are scanning for these IPs are basically the same. When something's scanning, he's scanning for both of these ports, not just one of them, in most cases. So that's why you see this kind of conjunction of these two activities together. And it's related, so that's why they're doing it, and we'll look at that in a second here. So if you Google MikroTik 8291 exploit, you're going to find lots of hits. There's been various exploits over the years, probably going back 4 or 5 years. There are a couple of interesting ones that I liked, so I pointed one out here that somebody had posted. It's a bit dated. It's about 1.5 years old, maybe a little over a year old, but it talks about how much MikroTik is out there and what you see and how he did his scanning. So I recommend people take a look at that if they're interested. The 8291 TCP port is what's called Winbox. And this Winbox service on MikroTik is really an administrative interface that they have a software package that allows you to, software package called Winbox that MikroTik offers, that allows you to, if you have a whole bunch of MikroTik routers, manage them all with this kind of Windows client. And it keeps track of them all. You can patch them all and all that kind of stuff. So it's kind of nice from that perspective, but it has some vulnerabilities in it on occasion. I think there was like an unauthenticated like file disclosure type vulnerability that showed you the login IDs and passwords in at least one older version of MikroTik if you're not updated with it. So if you use MikroTik in your environments, you definitely want to take a look at this. Make sure you're up to date and patched because there have been various vulnerabilities over the years. The 8728 TCP port is an API port. I forget exactly what it's used for, but I referenced the links here. They actually have very good documentation up on MikroTik's website about the protocols. They're not HTTP-based protocols. They're their own kind of custom protocol, but you can take a look at them and how they work if you're really interested. The port 5555 TCP, this is the Android debug bridge, and we're looking at the scan steps. I actually pulled up a 5-year chart. So I'm kind of glad that we keep as much history as we do, because you could see that this has been going on for quite a while. There is a little bit of a little chink in here where it's cut out, and that's because we had a little missing data. So that's not that the activity actually stopped. We actually missed a little data when we did a massive system upgrade on our system. So just ignore that. But back here in the 2017, actually early 2018, I guess it is, because this is the end of 2017. But maybe like, I'm going to guess March, April, just eyeballing of 2018, that maybe February, we started to see a real kind of continued uptick in scanning on this port. And I know we've talked about it over the years for quite a while now. And to give people some context, the Android debug bridge, pretty much every Android device you have phones. So there's lots of devices that are based on the Android operating system. Obviously, you know about phones like Samsung devices, et cetera. But there are other types of devices, set-top boxes that run on Android, all kinds of things that run on the Android operating system. And as part of that, they have what's called a debug bridge. It's basically a port that you can activate and turn up and connect a debugger to it so that you can debug, if something's going wrong in your code. So you can kind of interactively work with your code while it's running on the device. On occasion, some manufacturers, when they've shipped their Android devices, have forgotten to disable that debug bridge port. So there are some devices out there that have that, shipped from the manufacturer, erroneously leaving that enabled. And what it does is it kind of gives open access to that device if it's exposed to the internet. So somebody could connect to it, and instead of debugging, they could say, well, how about you download this payload and run it from this location? And that's basically what people have been doing, or bad actors have been doing. You'll also notice there's a couple of spikes early on. This would have been some testing back in like the 26 time frame, people doing some testing or research. But it was really in the early 2018 time frame that this stuff really kicked up, and it's kind of consistently kept up over the years. People just continue to keep scanning for it. And there's been lots of botnets, families out there over the years that have integrated this into their scanning and exploits so that they, this is one of their means for propagation and spreading of their botnet. So again, looking at the honeypots, I took a look to see what can we actually see in terms of scanning on this port. And in large majority, you'll see payloads like this. I obfuscated our honeypot IP here, but this is from yesterday morning. And a couple of attacker IPs connected to it on port 5555. And they pass this kind of gobbledygook string, which gets gobbledygooked in ours, but it starts with the word CNXN. And that is kind of, in my mind, I know that is the Android debug bridge. That's how you basically, it's the preamble for when you connect to the Android debug bridge service to say, hey, I'd like to make a connection with you. And I referenced some articles here as well that talk about this. This one actually I thought was pretty good because even it's very old, and as we said, it's this has been going on since 2018. People have documented this quite well, and here is an actual packet decode of somebody that an actual exploit that went all the way through. So they did the connection to instantiate connection, and then they tried to do this shell command to go download. It's basically very similar to the other one we saw before, where they're basically passing in some Linux command line shell that's saying, go run wget, fetch this file, and then go run it, basically, and then delete it after you run it. So that's how they would infect a device. A lot of Android-based systems have a Linux, basically underpinnings into it from an OS level. So that's what's happening here in this particular exploit. And that's how we know when we see this, that this is indeed somebody looking for Android debug bridge. I will mention that there are a couple other services that run on 5550 TCP that people target. One of them specifically, there are a bunch of embedded devices like IoT, small IoT devices, and I think some DVRs that run the TR69 protocol. on 5555 TCP, and we see some exploitation attempts against that as well. TR69, if you're not familiar with it, is like a management protocol. It's not Android debug bridge, but typically it listens on a different port that I can't think of off the top of my head. But if you just Google TR69, you'll find all about it, and that there are additional attacks on that as well that do very similar things in terms of an exploit mechanism where they embed some instructions into the request from the TR69 request in order to try to get the device to reach back out and infect itself. And that's all I really had. I don't know if anybody had any other thoughts or questions or insights about any of this.
No, it's just interesting that it started, that has been nonstop. I guess they keep finding things, right? I guess people still keeping their Android debug bridge exposed. I remember it was around that time that they released, and maybe that's what led it to people using it more. I think 2017 or 2018, where they released the ADB tool set as a separate thing. Like, you used to have to download the whole like Android Studio thing to be able to get access to it, and I think eventually it was just its own package, and you could just go get it. And then and then people started using it to like, oh, I just want to like download stuff off my phone, or like, oh, I just want to do this little thing. Like, it became very user friendly, and I'm wondering if that led to the point where people were just like, well, I want to access my TV from wherever. Let me open 5555. I don't know. Because
right.
I think that's also around the time where we've been seeing a lot more devices, like you were saying, that are not just phones, right? Like, we have TVs, and we have, tablets, and there's just a lot of things that are TV, there's not TVs, but like a set-top box, right? Like, it's Android as well. And a lot of things are just Android run, like it's, and they all use that port,
right?
Potentially for the Android debugging tools. So.
Right, they could. Yeah, and then, like you said, there's a lot of. I'm sorry, keep stepping on each other.
No. I was going to say
there is a lot of probably unknown to people devices that run on Android. A lot of Intel had their Intel Inside marketing campaign. Somebody really should have an Android Inside marketing campaign, because you'd be surprised at how much out there is actually running with Android underneath it that you don't even realize. And the other thing about it that makes a lot of this kind of just go on forever like it has been is that people are probably largely unaware that their devices are compromised. I bet you if you looked at like the last 5 days of activity of scanning on this port and protocol, that you would find that it's the same people that were scanning, 3 years ago. When people get infected with this, because there's such low touch on a lot of the Android-based embedded devices, they don't really know or have the ability to see that it's, communicating on this port, or something's communicating to it, or that it even got infected. So, it's just one of those things that once it's happened, unless you're really tech savvy, you're probably not going to even know that you've been compromised. And it'll just stay like that for years until you get rid of it and get a newer device.